Hello YouTubers, welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha and finally made it to the end of my Hannibal Lecter reviews. I miscounted actually. I said there was 8 videos I was going to do altogether. Actually it's 10 if you count all the films, the book adaptations, which is 8 videos, Manhunter 9, and the TV series, which is 10. So there you go, 10 Hannibal Lecters. I feel like there's nothing I don't know about the character now. I could maybe do it as a specialist subject on Mastermind. I reckon I could give that a fair run for its money now. So this is the final video. This is chronologically where we get up to in the film world. You know, the what is so far the end of Hannibal Lecter's story to date. As I said in the last video, it's I believe there will be further stories, or at least one final story one day, in whatever form that will be. I know the TV series, they did intend to wrap up the story of Hannibal Lecter if that had done the full 6 or 7 series that they intended to do. However, we're not talking about the TV series, we're talking about the movie Hannibal today. So again, I'm going from my Hannibal Lecter box set, the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter films, which contains Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, and the final film that I'm looking at today, 2001's Hannibal, directed by Ridley Scott, with a screenplay credited to the playwright David Mamet and Schindler's List writer Steven Zalen. I did touch on the film quite extensively in my last video, so I feel I've already kind of started to talk about this. So if you really want my full thoughts on the film, I'd suggest watching these two back to back. Because whereas in that review I did a lot of comparisons from book to film, and I'm going to continue that trend a little here, if you don't mind me. Simply because, you know, I have just read the book and seen the film in conjunction with each other, so the two are kind of springboarding in my mind. That they're what's at the forefront of my consciousness at the moment, so I think you'll forgive me on that point. Hannibal. As I said, the screenplay is credited to David Mamet and Steven Zalen. For what I understand, I think Ted Talley was offered the chance to write this, but like I said in the last video, you know, he was one of the casualties of the original production team from Silence, who bit the dust of their own volition. They felt that they couldn't. Well, I think they balked at some of the excesses of the novel and the source material, and they felt that they couldn't. It was just such a tough act to live up to, the first film, that they really couldn't do it justice. So here we have Mamet and Zalen. From what I understand from seeing the special features on the DVD, I think David Mamet's was really a token credit. The screenplay in the film, well, I mean, Ridley Scott refers to it throughout as being Zalen's screenplay. From what I understand, Mamet did a first draft which needed a lot of revisions, and then he had to go off and do his own film. But Mamet is such a big name, at least in the writing world. You know, he wrote in film. You know, he wrote The Untouchables, Glengarry Glen Ross, The Edge. Really good writer. I mean, if you've had him, you know, anywhere near your screenplay, obviously you're going to stick his name in the credits, even if the final film doesn't really mirror his original intentions that greatly. The film, it retains Harris's story pretty much intact from the book, with the exception of the ending, which I've touched on before and I'll get onto again. But oddly enough, this is of all the films, I think this is the one that's changed the most from book to film. What remains intact is Harris's plot and the structure of the book, which is wise because that's as I've said before, that's Harris's strong suit. Really, is his plotting and characters. His dialogue in the book is not quite as inspired as it was in The Silence of the Lambs, say, where you'd be a fool if you were adapting Silence of the Lambs to not sort of transplant at least the Hannibal Lecter dialogue and the Hannibal Lecter Clarice Starling scenes wholesale from the film, because they just crackle. Every line is sort of pitch perfectly written. Here his dialogue is a little. Well, in the book, his dialogue was a little more uninspired. So, I'll forgive Stephen Zalen for taking a few creative liberties and rewriting a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the minuscule beats of the scene. As long as he kept the story intact, well, sort of 90%, then I'm happy with that. I'll just go over briefly the few losses from the book that didn't make the final cut of the film because of economy. It's a 600-page novel that they had to condense into a 2-hour 10-minute film. So the casualties obviously were Margot Verger, Mason Verger's bodybuilder sister, who is in the TV series. She isn't a bodybuilder in the TV series, but they remained true to her sexuality, but went for a more lipstick lesbian approach in the TV series. So you sadly lose her, and well, spoiler alert, but she's actually the one who's responsible for the demise of Mason Verger. So again, something they retained in the TV series, the whole subplot of her wanting a child with her lover, a Verger heir to carry on the line. So, the portrayal of Mason Verger in the book is far more monstrous. You do have allusions to the fact that he was a child molester in the film, but giving him a sister in the book, he also had allusions to the fact that he had molested Margot as a child, and so her story really was about revenge and a very, very twist. Again, something from Harris's twisted imagination. He came up with this whole subplot of her basically getting semen out of her to impregnate her lover to carry on the Verger line after his death, and then she's ultimately responsible for his death in the film, not Cornell in the film, which was a far more satisfying conclusion to the character in the book. So you lose that little subplot, I guess, for economy, really, which is a shame. You also get a little subplot with her and Barney. Barney sticks around the Mason estate, the Verger estate in the film a lot longer, and he develops a friendship with Margot, which nearly spills over into a sexual relationship. Jack Crawford's sadly missing from the film, I guess because in the book, he crops up just for exposition purposes, which could easily be transposed to different characters. I think if Scott Glenn hadn't turned the film down, I guess he would have been in the film in some capacity, but from a story point of view, he's not really missing because he doesn't really further the plot that much, and he could have been easily lost. I know that there was, in the deleted scenes, there is a brief mention that Crawford has died, but Ridley Scott said that the casual cinema audience might not remember who Jack Crawford is specifically. They'll remember Scott Glenn, but they won't necessarily remember that his name was Jack Crawford. So a mention of his death would maybe take the casual movie going audience out. So best just not to mention Crawford at all and his fate. God knows who would have played him in this film if they had decided to include the character. He seems to regenerate more than Doctor Who. There's a whole subplot about Inspector Patsy and Florence getting the fingerprint to prove that Dr. Fell is really Dr. Lecter that bit the dust. It made the Florence sequence more intricate in the book, and I guess you're not really losing anything. The whole getting the fingerprints scene is really a sort of when it comes to the pickpocket scene, it's really just a repeat of that beat. So it would have been just playing the same beat twice. And we'll turn off now if you want to avoid spoilers, because I'm sure I've already spoilt the plot enough in my book review, but the death of Crenla is left more ambiguous in the film. In the book, he's out and out killed with a crossbow at the dinner table, which I kind of preferred. I kind of would have liked to seen after the fate that he befalls. I would have liked to seen him put out of his misery in a way, because the last shot you see of Crenla, played by Ray Liotta in the film, is of him in the kitchen, sort of reduced to his 5-year-old self, with his skull missing, and then there's this moment where Hannibal throws a tea towel over his head, and there's something about that I find even more upsetting than having his skull removed. The fact that there's a tea towel over his head, I'm thinking, that'll be on his brain. Scott seems to think that the character dies at that point, but it's left ambiguous, and I would have liked to have seen an act of euthanasia on his part. It's not as bad as like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where some of the upsetting elements of that film stem from how dirty the film is. There's dirty tea towels here and there. One thing you can say about Hannibal Lecter is he is clean. He looks like a mass murderer who at least showers. Wisely changes a lot of the dialogue from the book, which I've said. The book did feel oddly lacking, which was surprising considering how good the dialogue is in Red Dragon and Silence. How economic the dialogue was. I'm going to talk briefly about Ridley Scott, because he's not really my favourite director, or one of my favourite directors. This will come as a surprise, actually, because I'm going to do another review today of a film that's in my top 10 list, which is actually a Ridley Scott film, funnily enough. I'm reviewing Blade Runner later on today, in which I will rant, not rant, I will rave about that film and Scott's direction in that. I think, although I love Blade Runner and I love Alien, those films are nearly 40 years old now, and for me, he never really has hit the heights of those two masterpieces since then, despite many film buffs and film geeks insisting that he's still on top of his game. I find him... The thing about Ridley Scott is, he started out as an artist. He storyboards all his films, and famously, Alien was only meant to be a cheapo science fiction film until Ridley Scott came on board, and he managed to actually double the budget of that film, simply on the strength of his storyboards alone. He made it look so dynamic and cinematic in storyboard form that he was able to double the budget. So he's a great cinematographer, he's a great production designer, visual artist, but and his films always look fantastic, but he sucks at characterization, and characterization is something that's so important, I think, for myself to engage with the film. I need to engage with the characters, and it's just not his strong suit. He said famously that he only does a couple of takes maximum with his actors, because and his direction of actors, Anthony Hopkins says, is do it a bit faster, do it a bit slower. He doesn't go in depth and talk about talk about the complexity of it all in depth. And Hopkins says, this is how directors should be. Hopkins says he finds things like rehearsal and discussing the minutiae of the scene in depth ultimately pointless. A good director should just say, go faster, go slower. Well, that's easy to say if you're Anthony Hopkins and you're one of the greatest actors in the world. Marlon Brando used to say similar things, about. But I think the greatest actors in the world are the ones that find it easy to do. So I imagine that's why Ridley Scott probably gets so much work, because he is economic. He will produce a movie a year or a movie every other year, but his hit rate, for me, it's kind of hit and miss. Don't get me wrong, there are films of his that recently that I've enjoyed, but for every The Martian, there's a Lust of Affair, like Days of Heaven. So he's hit and miss as a director, and that's because I find his films quite emotionally unengaging, just because he can engage brilliantly on a visual level, but not an emotional one for me. So I think Hannibal is no exception. That's pretty much one of the reasons I don't engage with this film as fully as I do with Silence or even maybe Red Dragon, actually. The film shifts the focus very much from being a thriller as well to the gothic horror element. Again, what was subtext in Silence becomes the text here, and what's drawn me into the Hannibal Lecter stories is the fact that they are thrillers. The Jonathan Demme and Jodie Foster have both said that they were surprised that The Silence of the Lambs was perceived as a horror movie, because as far as they were concerned, they were making a thriller. And when I read the book, I engaged with it as a thriller, and that was really the film that I imagined in my head. I was surprised that it was really a horror movie that I saw, an expensive, lavish-looking horror movie, almost a vampire movie, if you will. And there are thriller elements here. There are police procedural elements here. There is, but Scott has lost a lot of the investigative elements. The things I loved in the book was the getting of the fingerprint. Julianne Moore, comparing the X-rays of Lecter's arm and seeing that one was broken and one was not broken, and therefore ascertaining what that one X-ray was older than the other. Stuff like that just fell by the wayside, and that's why I don't really engage with the film as much. Speaking of Julianne Moore as a replacement for Jodie Foster, who may have pulled out because she didn't like the book, or it may be because she was in pre-production of a film that she was set to direct that never got made, called Flora Plum. I think I like Julianne Moore, and I think she did a pretty good job actually as Starling. You do actually forget about Jodie Foster in a funny sort of way, or at least you're not completely comparing the two performances when you're watching the film, and that's a credit to Julianne Moore. She makes the character her own. It's not a flat out impersonation. It's her own interpretation of the character. Remains truthful to the character. Gives the character the same integrity that Jodie Foster did, and remains true to the background. She does the southern accent very well. So yeah, no problems with Julianne Moore. Would have loved to have seen Foster back in the role. Obviously, you're always, that's always going to be a niggle whenever you recast anything. Is you're always going to imagine what the film would have been like with the other actor playing it. But of all the actresses that they considered for the role, I think they considered Kate Blanchett, Hilary Swank, Ashley Judd. Who else? Gillian Anderson. Helen Hunt. I think they considered as well. I think Moore was probably the best choice. Gillian Anderson would have been interesting, but I mean, essentially, it would have been Dana Scully with an accent. So that's probably why they didn't go that way. And then Gillian Anderson ended up in the Hannibal TV series, but as a very different character anyway. So no problem at all with Julianne Moore playing the role, but would have loved to see Foster back in the role. Maybe having read the book, that's what makes me notice more of the changes from the book. I mentioned Verge's fate. The changes from the book. The problem I have with the film isn't that they changed the book, although because a lot of films change elements from the book. It's the fact that, having read the book, the changes they make are so uninspired. I said in the last review, if they wanted to change the ending, fine, because they didn't feel it was truthful to their portrayal of Starling, fine, but you really need to come up with something that's as entertaining. I really didn't like the resolution to the story in this. It makes sense, I guess, on a thematic and character level. Lecter sacrificing part of himself for his love of Starling. So I guess there is still an allusion to the love story, and it's kept subtextual. But I don't know. And it does end on. I do like the final scene where he's on the plane. It's as ghoulishly, blackly comic as the final scene in Silence, and it's not a direct lift from the book. It's sort of inspired by the book. So the final scene was okay, but the whole resolution to the Starling Lecter storyline kind of left me a little nonplussed. So like, oh, okay, he's gone, and I guess she carries on with her life. Maybe not in the FBI anymore, but wherever she is. Verge's fate, I felt was uninspired. It made much more sense for his sister to kill him in the book, whereas in the film they leave it down to his right-hand man Cordell to end his life, and it's just not built up at all like the Margot Verge Mason Verge storyline in the plot. It's just, oh well, we haven't got this character, so why don't you kill him instead? Well, I thought you were his right-hand man and would do anything for him. It doesn't make any sense that Cordell would kill Verge because He's gone this far with his plan. He set all this up, the maze with the boars, and he's tended to this guy for years. Why he would suddenly turn around and go, okay, no, I'm going to end this guy's life now. It just comes out of nowhere. Even with and having Hannibal suggest it as well. It would have made more sense if Hannibal had ended Verge's life personally. I don't get the decision to put it into the hands of Cordell at all. So I have largely criticised the film. It's not a terrible film, but it does have its problems. It works. It does work kind of as a tone poem. Julianne Moore says that there's a dreamlike quality to the film, especially towards the end. But so it works on that front. But it falls short as a thriller for me. Gothic horror, black comedy. Yeah, you really need to view it as a kind of black comedy, gothic horror, tone poem, whatever you will. Ultimately, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. If you make a sequel to what's considered an all-time classic, and the shadow of a much better film looms large over the proceedings in this all the way, sadly. So there you go. Let's do that at the end. If you see me do that, that means the review is over. That's my thoughts on Hannibal. That's my thoughts on the entire Hannibal Lecter canon. Maybe I'll do more of these reviews if I'm sure there will be more Hannibal Lecter related stuff in the future. They're not. No one's killing that cash cow just yet. But until next time, folks. Join me later when I will be reviewing another Ridley Scott film, Blade Runner. And until then, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see everyone out there in YouTube land.